So Honda are one of the leading car manufacturers, and it's no surprise we get a lot of requests for upgrades and tuning advice on Hondas. So this is it. This video has been put together to help you to make wise decisions regarding improving the performance and the handling of your Honda. We're going to look at some mods that people often do, but they don't necessarily bring very much of a return. And there's certainly something very special about Honda engines with their high revving nature, the sound they make when the VTEC mechanism kicks in, and the legendary reliability. So it's no surprise that a lot of kit car projects are resorting to using Honda engines with their phenomenal potential for power gains and power increases. But tuning a Honda is quite different from tuning a lot of other conventional engines today, partly because of the way that the Honda engines are built and the way they're designed. So unlike typical engines, Hondas are very well built, very precisely engineered and manufactured. This is really down to the company ethos, the training they give, the expertise that goes into every single engine. And no surprise that at the top of reliability tables year after year after year, you tend to find Honda models cropping up. So the design of a Honda engine generally is quite high revving. So a lot of manufacturers have gone with lower revving, higher torque outputs, but Honda have balanced the engine. By using different length rods and different crank designs, they're able to produce engines that have really high RPM levels, which allow them to fully extract all of the power from the engines. Got a small favour to ask before I go on. Can you just drop us a like and let me know in the comments what car you've got, because that really does help me to shape the content of this channel, just to make sure that I'm covering the things that you want me to cover. So getting 100 brake horsepower per 1000 cc's is a sort of benchmark that a lot of engine manufacturers aim for. A lot of people consider that to be a particularly efficient engine. Honda have come along, and with engines like the one they used in the Honda S2000, they managed to extract about 123 brake horsepower per 1000 cc. Just really testament to the engineering, and it was a record that Honda held for a considerable period of time. I think it was a Ferrari that came along and actually beat that record about 10 years later. So the K20 was an important engine for Honda. It came in around about 2000. Things were really starting to happen in the motoring world. There were lots of development with people going over to using catalytic converters. Fuel injection systems were becoming ever more complex, and there was a demand from consumers to have engines that offered more power. Now, one of the biggest innovations that Honda have come out with on their engines is the VTEC system. So essentially you've got a cam that decides when the intake valve and the exhaust valve opens and closes, and ideally in a performance engine you want that optimized so you're extracting the maximum amount of power from the engine, allowing as much air in as possible, the maximum amount of combustion, and getting those exhaust gases out as quickly as possible. So the cam does a lot to control the way this all works. Now with the VTEC system, you've effectively got two cams. You've got a standard road cam that is smooth, economical, ideal for driving in everyday traffic, and then you've got the VTEC zone. So when the engine hits the set RPM and the VTEC kicks in, it switches to the more sporty cam load profiles, and that really ups everything in the engine and helps you to extract more power. So with a conventional engine, if you put a fast road cam in it and it's quite an aggressive cam, you'll tend to get quite a lot of choppy idling at low RPMs. Honda have completely got around that, because basically you're on a different cam profile at those low RPMs, and with the higher RPMs you've got a much sportier profile. So the engines really do scream and come alive in that VTEC zone. Within the Honda engine range, you've got some fantastic engines. You've got the D series, you've got the K series. There's so many different mods and upgrades for these. We certainly can't go into too much detail in this particular video. We're going to do other videos dedicated to each of the generations of Honda engines and what the best mods are for those. But thankfully, within the Honda K series engines and the D series engines and all the different engines that they've knocked out over the years, there's a lot of options where you can swap parts around. So you might refer to this as a Franken build, where components from more than one engine are bolted together. So it was quite common to get the 2.4 K series from a Honda Accord and put a Honda VTEC head-on from a 2-litre K series, and you've got the extra torque and extra capacity of the larger capacity engine down low. So the K24 actually also has a slightly larger bore size, but you've also got got the high revving characteristics and the easy breathing and great fueling characteristics of the head from the slightly smaller K-Series engine. So the 217 horsepower Civic K-Series K20 engine, for example, shifts around 316 CFMs of air on the intake. So these cars are really good at sucking in air, and if you can mix that with fuel, it will be met with substantial amounts of power at the other end. So a lot of enthusiasts within the Honda world refer to that sort of mod as the K-Frank, and it's quite a popular upgrade just because these parts are readily available and they bolt on. So if you know what you're doing, it's quite easy to get components from different versions of the same engine that you've got and create something special that Honda never even imagined from the factory. So you can take your Honda to the highest levels. So we've said that the Honda engines tend to have a higher RPM range than most engines. So it changes very slightly the method that you would use to tune it. So first of all, we would usually recommend that people get an ECU upgrade on the car or get a remap done. So with Honda, it's a little bit more challenging because a lot of the ECUs over the years are locked. You can't map them very easily. So the option has been to go with an aftermarket ECU or to get plug-in modules that take over from the ECU and allow a little bit of adjustment of the parameters within it. So Hondata is quite a popular unit that a lot of people have used, and there's a few others as well. We'll put links in the description below to a lot of the alternatives on offer, and also to the articles on our site that refer to the many different engines, so you can get the best options for your particular car. So because they're higher revving, they tend to shift a lot more air and a lot more fuel. So your method of tuning it is to get it to burn that fuel more effectively. So with the exhaust, you tend to find that the exhaust and intake on most stock Hondas is certainly up to the job of the factory spec, but when you started increasing it, you're certainly starting to hit a restriction. The upper limits have been set really with the factory limits in mind, and there's not an awful lot of scope to go beyond that on most Honda engines. So with Honda exhaust mods and upgrades, it certainly makes sense to make sure that the engine can not only breathe in, but can also breathe out. So any restrictions in the flow of the exhaust could be a potential bottleneck. Now, thankfully, it's not a great problem on most Honda models. You've got a decently designed exhaust system. But if you're tuning an engine and you're making the higher power figures in the top end of the RPM range, you may well be hitting a restriction. And with Hondas, the most common restrictions tend to be in the exhaust headers and the catalysts. So if you're able to, in your area, replace the catalyst with a sports alternative, that can certainly improve its ability to breathe out. Now, I always say to people, don't go with the largest exhaust you can find. Most people have in their mind that a large bore exhaust will actually flow really well. But one of the most important things when tuning a car's intake and exhaust is to make sure the velocity is correct. So ideally, you'll have a system where the exhaust and the intake is closed up at low RPMs and then it opens up at higher RPMs, which is mechanically very, very challenging. A few manufacturers have got systems that effectively achieve this, but in most cases, it's just a case of compromising and getting an optimal setup that gives you the best flow rates in the bits of the power band that you use the most often. So on an engine like the K20, most people I've spoken to recommend about a 3-inch bore size on the exhaust as being round about the optimal setup. But obviously the way the exhaust is constructed, the bends in it, what it's made from, and how the silencer works, whether it's just got baffles or it's got a more sports straight through silencer setup, will make a big difference to its ability to free up the flow of air through the engine. So it certainly makes sense, first off, just to remove restrictions in the intake and the exhaust before you start adding other mods. So unusually for an engine manufacturer nowadays, I shouldn't really say unusually because there are a few that do it, but extracting 100 bhp per 1000 cc's is quite unusual. Not many car manufacturers can extract so much power from 1000 cc's of capacity. So we often see 200 horsepower coming from a 2-litre Honda engine, and they've done a really good job of setting these up. So you might be tempted to do some head work, get the valves enlarged, port and polish the head, but it's a challenge because Honda research and development department have done a pretty good job to start with. So bearing in mind on most engines you've actually got a pretty good base to work from, where can you go? Well, tuning an engine is about getting it to burn more fuel and more air. So any method that gets more fuel and more air into the engine has got to be a win as as far as tuning your Honda goes. So uprating the fuel pressure regulator is probably one of the quickest and easiest ways of getting those injectors to squirt more fuel. It's a little bit clunky though, so ideally you would uprate the fuel pump, uprate the injectors, and get them to deliver adequate fuel for your tuning. We've seen a lot of turbo kits around for Hondas that pretty much just bolt on. So companies have got together, they've looked at all the different parts that you would need, and they've come up with a kit that can bolt on to the manifold on your K-Series engine, for example, and pretty much double the power of your engine fairly easily. So a turbocharger would certainly force a lot more air into the engine. So as long as the fueling is right and the engine ECU can handle the new characteristic, you're in a win-win situation where you're making substantially more power. The Type R engines are a complete rework of the standard blocks of engines, and the Type R cars are completely different. So they don't just contain uprated brakes, for example. The whole hub has been redesigned. The differentials have been optimized so you can get the maximum amount of power on the road without experiencing torque steer. We've also seen innovations coming in like liquid filled bushings on some of the later Honda Civics and on the Honda Type Rs, and the suspension has been tuned to perfection on a lot of the Type R models. So if you've got a non-Type R version, you're probably thinking about turning it into a Type R, and that is certainly a really good and admirable goal to have. But bear in mind that it would probably be cheaper and easier to go out and buy a Type R. But where's the fun in that? So I have to acknowledge that a lot of people are not looking at the cost, they're not looking at the hassle. They want to enjoy their time with the car, working on a project and creating something unique. So if that applies to you and you're not worried about the time or the money, then by all means upgrade your non-Type R and get it as close to the Type R spec possible. And you may well build a unique car that outperforms a Type R. So the recent Civic Type R has established records on the Nürburgring in Germany where they've come in at well under 8 minutes. That sort of benchmark that was held for many, many years for production cars, and they've essentially smashed through it with what is effectively a family car. I say a family car, it's not really a family car, there's a lot of performance there, but if you want a car that's got 4 seats and is fairly practical for a family, then the Type R is certainly an option to go for. It also looks stunning with its various wings and spoilers and the vents and the overall styling of it. So over the years there's been a few collaborations between other brands. So one notable one that I recall particularly was between Honda and the British manufacturer Rover. So the Integra was born of that collaboration. So Rover in the UK released the Rover 200 series, which looked very much like an Integra. I actually owned one. I owned the Rover 220 GTI, and it was a fun car to drive, but they didn't put a Honda engine in it. They put a Rover engine in it, and I really did struggle with reliability. So it was a great car, a great design, but let down with the British engineering that went into that engine and probably the way it had been looked after over the years before I actually got to it. But back on Hondas, so tuning Hondas, getting more power up the engine is down to increasing the fueling and increasing the air supply. But once you've got the car moving faster, you need to think about its handling. There's no point having a car that goes from 0 to 60 in 2 seconds if it can't go around a corner and it can't stop adequately. So think carefully as well about the brakes of your car. So going with really big brakes is usually what most people think of, but you're limited by the amount of grip that those tyres can offer. So if your tyres are starting to lose traction, it doesn't matter what size brakes you have, you're not going to improve the stopping distance substantially. So larger discs tend to have the effect of giving you more of a progressive stopping feel at the pedal, but without necessarily reducing the stopping distance of the car. So one of the easiest upgrades and mods that you can do on your Honda is just to fit uprated brake pads. Now don't go with race spec brake pads because they require quite a bit of heat to get into them before they get into that biting range. So their performance pads are designed for a performance environment where they are going to be hot most of the time, and that's where you want them to be biting and effectively stopping the car. So you put them on a road car, they will generally make a lot of noise because they're too cold, and they won't bite anywhere near as effectively as even the original equipment manufacturer pads. So you've stuffed your braking and you've got annoyances of extra noise and probably a lot more brake dust and more wear and tear on your discs. So choose a decent fast road pad, and that'll go a long way to improving the stopping power of your Honda. Another thing to think about is the suspension setup. Now most people would have in their minds dropping the car low, fitting hard springs, and that might work well on a track where you can guarantee the surfaces are flat, but on a road where you're dealing with potholes, uneven road surfaces and varying driving conditions, it doesn't actually help the handling. You'll just create a car that is very annoying to live with on a day-to-day basis. So you really want to make sure that the suspension allows the tyres to remain in contact with the road. So I would argue that it's more important to get the geometry of the suspension correct rather than just the ride height of the car. So setting the camber angle of the wheels can really dramatically improve the cornering, and also the toe, the angle that the wheels are to the front of the car, can also dramatically affect its cornering ability. So on some models you need to fit additional suspension components to allow further adjustment to take place beyond what the original manufacturer states. So with alloy wheels, most people go with really large alloy wheels because they look good, but looking good is not really what we're about. We're after performance here, and when you add large alloy wheels, you are adding large amounts of unsprung weight to each corner of the car, and that's going to have an adverse effect on the car's handling. So you want to make sure your alloy wheels are fairly light, and also those low profile tyres that you need with the really high alloy wheel profile sizes can cause problems with handling in the wet. And let's face it, for most of us, especially us in the UK, we're driving on wet roads most of the time. So just think about that. It's not always the optimal setting to go with the largest alloy wheel that you can find. There's a lot of other options out there that are similar to the original equipment manufacturer sizes. They look stunning and they've been designed to be a lot lighter. So weight reduction in the car is probably a fairly easy way of adding performance to it. The lighter the car is, the faster it will accelerate from 0 to 60, and it will improve the handling. So if you can knock a bit of weight off the car, maybe fitting lighter panels, a carbon fibre bonnet has been used on quite a few projects that I've seen, and it looks really nice but reduces the amount of weight over the engine bay. But you can double that up and replace some body panels, but be careful, it might not be legal in your area to do so, because these things need to be type tested and crash tested to be approved for road use on a lot of areas, which can still be done even with carbon fibre panels. So the engines are fairly high revving, we've said, and one thing that can alter the characteristics of the way the engine revs up and revs down is the flywheel. If you fit a lighter flywheel to these engines, they will rev more quickly, they'll feel a lot more responsive. There's obviously an optimum amount of weight to have. You don't want to go too light, because the minute you hit a hill, the engine power is just going to bog down and it's going to feel the effects of that hill very quickly, and you'll have to really go hard on the throttle to compensate for that. But if you go too heavy with your flywheel, you'll notice that the car doesn't really slow up. That momentum just keeps going and keeps going. So there is an optimum balance there when it comes to choosing a flywheel for your car. So I hope this video has been informative to you. We've got lots of other videos coming up that deal with specific Honda models. We're looking at the Civic, the Integra, the S2000, and some of their other great collaborations over the years. So definitely stay tuned. If you haven't subscribed, please do so, just to avoid missing out on the content that we're putting out. And please drop us a like, it really helps us to get out there. Don't forget to stay tuned, and I'll see you in the next video.